It's great to see everybody here on the second day, so thank you for coming. You must be really interested in direct materials, or you must have some kind of curse, because direct materials is different, and most procurement technology companies have not tackled it compared to indirect over the years. So before I introduce my illustrious panel here, I wanted to toss up a slide, and I'm going to source it to Spencer at LightSource. Thank you, Spencer. Back when I was at Free Markets, we had similar slides, but I think Spencer encapsulates it more. Just a quick discussion of what is direct versus indirect procurement. So if you're in manufacturing, if you're a CPG company, if you're a utility or energy company, roughly 80% of what you spend, give or take, goes into cost of goods sold. And that's actually the bulk of procurement. But you might do it in procurement, you might do it in supply chain, you might do it in operations, but it's still spend. So this is everything from the very foundational things that go into what you buy or build. It could be active pharmaceutical ingredients in pharma. It could be ingredients in food and CPG. It could be metals, resin, printed circuit boards, capacitors in manufacturing or automotive. And it can also, be finished components as well. In contrast, indirect procurement typically goes into SG&A expense. And obviously, there are many types of indirect procurement areas. We won't get into that on this discussion, but it is distinctively different. So with that, I would like to introduce the panel. And we're going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes talking about direct versus indirect tech and why we haven't fully tackled direct yet. And then we're going to get into why we can tackle it with AI now more effectively. And yes, AI is a buzzword, but when it comes to targeting direct procurement, it does enable a tremendous amount that we couldn't go after before. So hopefully we get at the why and the how on this panel. So on my right here is Lisa Reisman, MetalMiner, previously Deloitte Consulting, and Arthur Andersen. I have Spencer here. Spencer is at LightSource, a direct materials technology vendor. He previously worked at Tesla on the Model 3. So if that Model 3 was advertised to get 250 miles or 400 kilometers and you're only getting 150, this is your van right here. And we have Sean on the end. Sean is at ARM, CPO of ARM. He was CPO at Splunk before that and previously spent 20 years as a consultant. We really thank Sean for joining us today. He got off the red eye. Our original panelist threw out his back. So we really are incredibly appreciative of you joining us.
My pleasure.
So with that, let me take out my list of questions here. So as I said, we will get into AI, but we first want to talk about the differences of direct and indirect tech. So why did the same things that work in indirect materials procurement technology not work for direct? So maybe we can go down here.
I'll just briefly talk about, I think it starts with the marketplace catalogs. I think a lot of companies use the catalogs to handle direct spend along with indirect spend. And most direct spend, especially if you have bills of material, you have custom parts and things of that nature, the catalog doesn't work as effectively. So, and I remember that back in 2000, that was one of the key differences.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Thank you for having me on the panel. I'm grateful to be here. I think one of the biggest differences between direct and indirect is the level of heterogeneity. So when I think about direct, there's just such a huge dispersion of the kinds of categories we see, everything from car parts to raw materials to PCBA to ingredients. Sometimes you'll even include CapEx and packaging. Versus indirect, where if it's Tesla buying an office chair or soap or something like that, the process you use there, and in fact the SKUs, like Lisa's saying, that you use there will be the same across tons of different Fortune 500 businesses. So I think there's a lot of reasons why there's been a lot more, it feels like, innovation to date in the indirect space, but I think it's sort of, I would say it's the more available fruit.
So for me, one of the biggest differences between indirect and direct is risk management. Risk is so much greater on the direct side than the indirect side. And that's one of the fundamental characteristics that makes it so much more different. And there are so many applications within AI to help on the direct side with that risk management. And I'm looking forward to what's coming next, because the market is relatively nascent right now when it comes to risk management, but you can imagine a world where if there's a natural disaster in, say, Indonesia or country where a lot of palm oil is grown, and for active pharmaceutical ingredients, which sometimes include palm oils, cosmetics, et cetera, if a storm is even predicted and you have a system that tells you, for instance, predictively, hey, this is how we can actually get ahead of this in the market. Here's some alternative suppliers to buy from right now. Here's the amount of stock that they have. Go ahead and purchase now, and you can actually, for instance, issue a PO right off the back of that analysis. There's just so much to be done in the world of risk management.
And I think to that, I might add as well, when you think about direct materials procurement, we've gone through a journey. Europe, not so different from the US over the years, but 25, 30 years ago, the big rush in the States was to look at China as a low-cost country sourcing region. I was part of, I guess, the sourcing cabal back then who facilitated spend going to China for the better or the worse. In Europe, it was Central and Eastern Europe, but also China. So now the other piece of direct is there's trade policy risk. In a given day, China could have export restrictions, or we could have new tariffs in a given trading block. So there are many other areas too. So a question, what do you view, maybe Spencer, you can take it, what are the major roadblocks to adoption today with direct materials technology?
That's a very good question. How honest am I supposed to be here? But
don't talk about the Model 3, so you can be honest.
No, there's certain things that are covered under my NDAs. And look, at Tesla, we were sourcing $30 billion of car parts, on Excel spreadsheets and emails. And that was sort of the genesis of our business, LightSource, is that I truly struggled to find something that I thought would work well. I think there's probably a few different things, and I'm just going to list a few ideas off the top of my head. One is, I think there's an incentive problem actually within procurement, and this gets really to the core, I think, of a lot of challenges we've seen with tech adoption, which is that if you are in procurement, there's no compensation or recognition for overperformance. There is a lot of downside for risk and other issues. And so in sales, if you go and sell $100 million of anything, you're getting, a huge commission, high fives, champagne, set of steak knives, And if you're in procurement and stuff doesn't arrive, you're really in trouble. But if you go and source really well and you build great supplier relationships and there's continuity, it's like a faucet running water. Like nobody's looking at that and saying, oh my God, you did such a great job. And so I think we've sort of incentivized people a little bit maybe to avoid technology for that reason, because there's always some risk trade-off in innovation. That's why they say fail fast at Facebook, because you have to try new things to really see what will work. I would say the second piece of this, at least for me, and I don't want to monopolize, but I think the ERPs have been actually a big blocker. When I think about the flow of payments in the direct space, it very often ends with a PO in the ERP system versus an indirect. It's the intake to procure usually happening in the P2P system. And we work with a lot of automotive OEMs or tier ones. They'll have like 36 different ERPs, like one for each factory. And when your data is so federated like that, it can be very difficult to even really begin to approach that elephant.
So it kind of raises the next question, and I promise we'll get into AI in a minute here. But anybody who's in manufacturing today, we could say, let's skip a generation and make ChatGPT the desktop or Copilot. But Excel is still the operating system for direct materials procurement. So why the heck is that? And maybe I'll toss it to you first, Lisa.
I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but a lot of it has to do with just the complexity of part spend and there's the simple proliferation of parts. So you need a system that manages a lot of data fields, et cetera. So I think that's probably the primary reason. And then you have the category managers just that sit on top of that and are in charge of monitoring those contracts. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but just updating part spend based on commodity volatility and commodity price changes in your contracts. It's more complicated, and so I think it's just default has gone to Excel, sadly.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I think part of the problem also is it's hard to set up events to source either new suppliers or from existing suppliers. It typically takes a lot of time. because you're keying in a lot of data. And one of the use cases for the future, quite possibly, is a lot of that data can be pre-populated, events can be spun up much more quickly, executed more quickly, you have stock that much more quickly as well.
Okay, so let's dive into 2024. So what's changed with technology and data, in the past 18 months that now makes it impossible to move beyond Excel and go after direct materials more effectively? So maybe we can start with you, Spencer.
So I think it's a great question, and a huge amount has changed, and it's continuing to change. And I worry that if I make any predictions on stage today, they will be invalid within like 2 weeks or something like that. I think the big change, and this has been going on for a while, right? Machine learning and AI haven't had such a meteoric rise in interest, but those processes have been around for decades, basically. The big change that happened in the last few years was the training of large language models. And so when people talk about AI today, 99% of what they're talking about are actually language models. Language models are very good at operating and dealing with language. And so we've seen a lot of things in the law space have been really amazing and really compelling. The copywriting space, everyone, their first thing was probably writing a happy birthday poem to a friend or something like that. But in the data space as well, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff where you can take unclean data and you don't have to have a perfect mapping of all the different versions of ABS plastic, A.B.S plastic, albutylstyrene plastic, and catalog thousands of possible free text fields. You can actually do it with models, and that's just one use case example. And I think the second big trend that's happening right now is what they call agentic workflows. So I don't know if it's a place we want to necessarily go here, but moving away from just SaaS applications where you're creating an operating system for people to use versus, hey, we're going to have an army of bots that go and do our bidding for us. And that's another big macro shift that, at least in Silicon Valley, we're hearing about seemingly every day now.
I'm going to comment on the 1% because it's where we live. And I think this is also, in some respects, game-changing. The notion of, the advanced neural nets, the XGBoost, the predictive models today that you can build are unbelievable. And when I say unbelievable, I mean you can create a 12-month forecast for an external market factor. Of course, we look at metals, so aluminum market, and have incredible accuracy. And so I kind of asked the question, what would you do as a business if you actually had access to an accurate 12-month forecast for anything? It can be oil, the US dollar, whatever it is. That to me is a game changer, and I think there's some focus in that area too. So that's what we're seeing, at least.
And the answer to that could be hedge fund. I'm just joking.
Thinking about it.
Yeah, I'd say one additional area that's really opened up, I'll give you an example. When I was a consultant, I worked at a utility company. The client was a utility based in the UK and in the States. And we ran an RFP. It took 6 months. It was 11,000 SKUs, well over 200 suppliers. You can't imagine how many rows and columns of data. It was absolute nightmare to pour our way through, many sleepless nights. With some of the predictive pricing models out there, for instance, those very same events we could have executed in a matter of 1 to 2 weeks instead of 6 months, and probably less than half the resources. So maybe 1 or 2 people could run the same thing now that took about 10 of us 6 months to do in the past. So I think the predictive pricing modeling and so forth, that's going to be a really ripe area, and it's enabled right now, in fact, and it's just going to get better as time goes on.
Can I add one more? I'm sorry. I just was going to say, I think there's a lot of innovation, too, around some of the really complex, yucky stuff that we don't like to do. Like, just think about bills of material. And if you take a walk out there, you'll see companies are using AI really efficiently. And you think about the number of parts companies have, and to be able to pull that out, model it out, see where the suppliers are. If you have the risk management piece kind of dovetailing in there. I think there's a lot of innovation around just the yucky stuff that on the direct material side, people don't really get into as much. So.
And I'll just double click on that point on bills of material for a minute. So we used to look at CAD drawings and a broader bill of material, within PLM or design and engineering software. And if you wanted to extract data that was useful for procurement, like, how much resin are my suppliers buying based on this print, or from an aluminum or stainless perspective, or how many capacitors, you needed to literally manually look at a print. And you probably needed a trained resource to do it. Somebody in procurement, unless they came from engineering, probably couldn't do it. Now with AI, you can extract that information, and then AI can extrapolate the actual material extended spend, if you will, within it. And again, just to give a shout out to some of the folks in the Innovation Hall, there's a few startups here today, if you wander, doing this. I mean, it's pretty exceptional. But maybe before we get into some more use cases, we can take a step back and define AI, which I think is really important, right? You've heard a lot about Gen AI today, but AI and machine learning goes a lot deeper than that. So maybe, Lisa, we can start with you in terms of, what are some different areas of AI and ML as applied to procurement technology?
Well, I'm going to only speak from my vantage point of what we're doing or how we're using it, and just kind of suggest some of the cases. So we basically try to look at any kind of process we have internally and say, can this be done by machine? And also, I think there's too much human interaction. So, think about forecasts. We've basically used machine learning. We've built, multiple linear regression models and ARIMA models to help us with kind of some short-term forecasting. And I think also customers like it better because they see that there's not like the human that's kind of going in there and saying, well, I think it's going to be this or that, and kind of messing up the forecast. So that's a use case, and obviously, we're looking at the long term as well. We really want to own that space of forecasting for the longer term, meaning 12 months or more, even up to 3 years. So people can think about, and again, that's all more the neural nets and some of the really advanced, XGBoost and probabilistic data. We have a lot of companies asking questions like, how do you factor in black swans? How are the black swan events kind of in your models? And some of these AI models, these neural nets, et cetera, allow you to model out these probabilistic scenarios. And then run scenarios on a regular model. And so then you can see, and again, no human interaction, but just the human gets to come in and say, I think we're going to get tariffs next month. Click, what is that going to look like to my aluminum spend? So that's how I think people are using. And again, we do the large language model to help ourselves answer questions, but we're really using sort of these advanced kind of, quantitative models to sort of predict the future.
And we'll go to you in a second, but I want to pick up on that for 1 minute. So somebody introduced me this week to the concept of spaghetti models for hurricane modeling. I'd never heard of this. I used to just watch the Weather Channel, and if you lived or had a house in the South in the US, or even in Asia with typhoons, you saw a cone of hell that was coming potentially to wreak havoc. But the concept of a spaghetti model is very similar to probabilistic modeling here, which if you looked at them this week with Milton, you saw anywhere between 10 and 25 lines, and there were lines converging, which would suggest the preferred path of multiple probabilistic models going in one direction. But if you throw in one factor, so in manufacturing it could be tariffs or it could be trade restrictions with China. If you throw in a factor with the weather, it could be a pocket of warmer water, or it could be a wind change. That can actually, like the butterfly flapping its wings, throw off one aspect of one model and completely shift the direction of a hurricane. So the notion of not thinking in terms of a cone, but thinking in terms of all those potential models, and it's almost like supply chain postponement. You can tweak it until the end. So would love to hear your thoughts, Spencer, on the different types of AI besides machine learning, neural nets, and probabilistic.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just to clarify, when I'm saying that what people are talking about 99% of the time, the reason this year there's been such a large amount of hype has been around language models. But I think Lisa's point is an exceptional one, which is that there is actually an entire multiple series of other classes of machine learning, including numerical methods and statistical models. Before LLMs, there was generative adversarial models. Today you have a new class of interaction called retrieval augmented generation, RAGs, where you tell a LLM, instead of give me the answer, go retrieve the answer from my data lake or data warehouse, that kind of thing. And so I think the question that, I'm burying the lead a little bit, Jason, but the question you asked, which is like, how do you define AI? I actually don't know the answer to that, but I do know that when people talk about AI, it's broadly the class of signal processing on data, and typically there's a training element where you feed in known data to build up a sort of a correlation, and then you feed in unknown data and you're able to get out a prediction. And in the case of Lisa's world, that's predictions about the future of pricing and metals and market movements. In the LLM world, it's actually predictions about the next letter or next word in a sentence. That's how the transformer model sort of began, was around translation. So there's a lot to it, but it's changing so quickly. That's like the thing that's really interesting is, I did a graduate degree in this field, and my co-founder was at Google X when they were developing a lot of the transformer technology. And even for us, we have to stay really close to the research if we want to make sure that we can talk about it eloquently. And even now, I'm like a little uncomfortable doing it because it's like there's somebody out there right now who's like, oh, he's got intel from like 3 months ago now.
Let me do a quick follow-up to that question.
Yeah, sure.
Not that I'm going to call you out on what you said 3 months ago.
Yeah.
But one thing that came out of listening to a bunch of presentations here, a lot of people are putting stock in Microsoft Copilot, which is great. It's based on OpenAI. OpenAI is the biggest $150 billion nonprofit, for-profit in the world. But
Former nonprofit. Well, they're a nonprofit in that they're not profitable, but they're not a nonprofit anymore.
Exactly.
So.
But they're doing great things. However, there are many other LLM providers out there. Mm-hmm. And maybe if you could just share a few in terms of, again, don't put all your eggs into one basket necessarily.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm not the expert of this, but maybe I'm one of the more knowledgeable people when we talk about the context of a procurement summit. I would say that there are foundational models, and this is one big change from, I think, the industry structure, a year or two ago, which is that it's very expensive and challenging to train a capable large language model. And so the main companies out there today, if I had to sort of list them, would be OpenAI, of course, meteoric rise with ChatGPT. A close follower is Anthropic. We use a number of Anthropic models. They have some models that are really powerful, like Claude Opus, and then they have some where they're designed to be cheaper to run, like Haiku. Mistral is one I hear about from time to time now. Google has Gemini. They have their own set of models. Microsoft uses OpenAI, but also has their own models. And then Facebook's strategy. They were actually one of the earliest companies working on deep learning, and Jan LeCun's lab. And they've basically gone scorched earth and open sourced their Llama 3 or Llama 2 or Llama 420. I don't remember the number at this point, but they're open sourcing that entirely. And so what you end up finding is that there's a lot of startups that are basically just wrappers around those models. And so for people who are like interacting with AI providers, one of the big challenges, I think, is there's a lot of magicians, but there's very few wizards, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so figuring out what's just a ChatGPT API with like a nice user interface versus who's really using it in a thoughtful way for a specific end use is actually a challenge I think a lot of CPOs are probably facing now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, Sean, if you're recovered from the 14-hour, 15-hour flight, I guess the question I would throw to you. So we've talked about some different modalities of AI, ML, and getting into foundational models. But from a CPO perspective, besides the obvious, which is we're working with Microsoft and they're leveraging OpenAI in their own, how else do I think about getting started besides engaging the ecosystem of procurement tech providers? But how do I think more foundationally, no pun intended, about my AI architecture?
Yeah, so for me, it's actually started very rudimentary, in a rudimentary fashion, that is. So when we look at our end-to-end source-to-pay process, we're right now implementing an AI-based orchestration tool. But what we also did, we've adopted both process mining software, which is really spotting some of the root causes of some of our challenges. But then we've also begun to implement RPA, which in a way is the most fundamental of all AI-type solutions, I would say. And so sometimes it's just start simple and figure out what are the right use cases such that you can eliminate some of the mundane, tactical, error-prone tasks that are done by people in the organization right now, such that you can actually automate those very same tasks. We're in the middle of implementing some right now. We just went live with a couple, and it's proven to be incredibly effective. So my point being, in terms of advice, is maybe just start a little bit small and get used to it, and then start to expand from there and look at more of the Microsoft-type solutions and so forth. For us, what we're using AI for are orchestration, risk management, and pricing. So looking at predictive pricing, basically. So those are the three core true AI use cases we're using it for. But RPA, you could almost argue, is a solution as well.
And you've got a complex existing procurement tech environment. You said, we talked, you've got Ariba in the background.
Yeah, we have a Frankenstein of different systems cobbled together in various states of integration or lack of integration. And so that's part of the reason that we're putting the orchestration layer on top. Is because right now, if somebody said, what is your average cycle time for a given category, I couldn't tell you, because we have so many different systems involved. By going to a single system, we'll be able to measure things much more accurately, and therefore start to target and pinpoint what the solutions will be. And the beautiful thing is the orchestration layer actually learns from itself. So that's going to be a great use case.
Can I just piggyback off a couple of things you said, Sean? So I think automation is the first place to start, to think about what is the painful. For example, one of the things we like to do is just, if you're doing like a Sandler pain funnel, what's the pain that companies are experiencing? So this is a basic one, right? They say, we have a lot of staff turnover, and guess what? It turns out people don't like working on Excel spreadsheets all the time, And so if you're updating, say, your part spend on a quarterly basis, and you're in charge of 10,000 parts, it's not that fun to sit there and monkey around with the formulas and the spreadsheets. So those are places where I think companies are seeing, and there's actually some companies here that are tackling some of those things. So automation's a big one. I think the other thing, too, is just, Frankenstein, I hate to say it, is common. So companies that are growing in the industrial sector space, they're just growing through acquisition. And so every company is Frankenstein, I hate to say it. There's very few companies, I think, that are just sort of, we're one version of everything. So I think that, so again, kind of saying, what do we do how can we put a layer over this, use AI, because the reality is swapping out all the systems to standardize is sort of a no-go nowadays. It's sort of, I think that automation and the Frankenstein model is the model, unfortunately.
Okay, so Spencer, I'm going to ask you to bring it home. So we got 1 minute. If you were to rethink your time at Tesla, and obviously don't breach any NDAs, but on a first principles basis, beyond Excel and email, how would you have designed on kind of a whether it's foundational models or just an approach to target direct spend if you were starting out there now with what's available?
That's a great question. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I would have bought LightSource. That's my business. So I looked for solutions like LightSource. I actually kind of assumed that something like it existed, and I was very disappointed to discover that there were kind of like, when I didn't have a real RFP process, but there were sort of two bad options. It was like stick with Excel and email, the devil we know, or a legacy provider, which was expensive, millions of dollars, and it was already dated by the time it was implemented. I think what exists today is much better than what existed then. We're talking about a decade ago. I think the ability for different systems to talk to one another, the willingness for companies to maybe go away from traditional suites and consider a set of best-of-breed solutions that really solve specific pain points. I think that's really powerful. And I think what can be done with a really small team, I think this was Lisa's point that I was thinking about since we talked backstage, that a small team enabled with better automation can do so much more than a big team without it.
So I'll just close. We got to wrap, but that notion in software development, if you're in the vendor community of like a 10x developer, like literally one developer can be as good as 50 regular resources. But small teams in this world, Scrum teams, it's unbelievable what you can do quickly within procurement these days. So thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.